In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a seasoned pilot vanishes from his cockpit moments before a crucial flight, leaving the Skylark grounded and secrets swirling. Enter Miss Jane Marple, whose keen eyes unravel a tangled web of ambition, jealousy, and betrayal. A nervous co-pilot hides a grudge, a gruff mechanic nurses resentment, a wealthy passenger points fingers, and a charming rival harbors a dangerous plan. With a dropped cigarette case and scuff marks in the grass, Miss Marple sets a cunning trap, peeling back layers of deception to reveal a truth that could save or doom the airfield. Will she find the pilot before it's too late? Chapter 1. The Empty Cockpit. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the village's thatched cottages and lending an air of quiet mystery to the day. In her neat parlor at Dane Mead Cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking with the steady rhythm of a metronome. The pale sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the worn Persian rug. She was halfway through a row of pearl stitches when the sharp ring of the telephone interrupted her thoughts. It was Mrs. Bantry, her voice aflutter with excitement, as was often the case when something out of the ordinary stirred the village. "Jane, you'll never believe it. There's been the most dreadful fuss at the airfield. Captain Grayson, Henry Grayson, you know, the pilot, has vanished, simply gone, without a trace, and his plane's due to leave for London in an hour." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mild blue eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Vanished, Dolly? That's most peculiar. A man like Captain Grayson, so dependable, doesn't simply disappear. Was he seen this morning?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Bantry replied, her words tumbling over each other. "He was at the airfield at dawn, checking his plane, the Skylark. Roger Blake, the co-pilot, saw him, and so did that grumpy mechanic, Tom Harris. But when it was time to board, he was nowhere to be found. The police are there now, and Arthur's beside himself. He's got shares in that airfield, you know." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her mind already turning over the possibilities. The airfield, a modest enterprise on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead, was a source of local pride, though not without its rivalries. Captain Grayson was a respected figure, known for his meticulous habits and steady nerve. A disappearance like this suggested something more than a mere whim or mishap. "I think, Dolly," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I might take a stroll to the airfield. Fresh air does wonders for clearing the mind." By 10 o'clock, Miss Marple was making her way along the winding lane that led to the airfield, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel. The mist had begun to lift, revealing the sleek outline of the Skylark on the tarmac, its propeller still and its cockpit ominously empty. A small crowd had gathered, villagers, a few passengers, and the police, led by Inspector Craddock, whose solid presence was both reassuring and, to Miss Marple's mind, a touch predictable. She approached Mrs. Bantry, who stood near the hangar, wringing her hands. "It's all so unsettling, Jane," she said. "Arthur says if this gets out, it could ruin the airfield's reputation, and poor Mrs. Grayson, she's at home, quite distraught." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the scene. The airfield was a simple affair, a single runway, a small control tower, and a cluster of buildings, including a lounge for passengers and a maintenance shed. Near the Skylark, Inspector Craddock was questioning a young man with a nervous twitch. Roger Blake, the co-pilot, she presumed. Nearby, a burly figure in overalls, Tom Harris, was polishing a wrench with unnecessary vigor. A woman in furs, clearly out of place in the rural setting, paced the lounge doorway. Mrs. Clara Wentworth, a passenger, Miss Marple, gathered from Mrs. Bantry's whispered commentary. And then there was Edward Vance, a rival pilot, leaning against a fence with a smile that struck Miss Marple as altogether too self-assured. 4 people with reason to be here, Miss Marple murmured, and perhaps one with reason to wish Captain Grayson gone. She adjusted her hat, a practical straw affair, and moved closer to overhear Craddock's questions. "Mr. Blake," the Gin-G system, Inspector Craddock was saying, "you saw Captain Grayson at dawn, correct? And then what?" Roger Blake shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping against his thigh. "Yes, sir. He was going over the flight plan, same as always. I left him in the cockpit and went to fetch coffee. When I came back, he was gone." Miss Marple's system. The inspector turned to Tom Harris, who was wiping his hands on a rag. "And you, Mr. Harris, when did you last see the captain?" Harris's scowl deepened. "Checking the engine, as I said. Everything was in order. Grayson was there when I finished up." Miss Marple stepped back, her mind already weaving. She had seen such scenes before, people with their secrets, their grudges, their ambitions, all laid bare under pressure. Captain Grayson's disappearance was no accident. She was certain. Someone had ensured that cockpit would be empty, and she intended to find out who. Chapter 2. The Suspects Assemble. The airfield at St. Mary Mead, though modest by the standards of larger towns, held a certain charm in its simplicity. The single runway stretched like a ribbon across the green fields, flanked by a low hangar and a cluster of buildings that served as control tower, lounge, and maintenance shed. By mid-morning, the mist had burned away, leaving a crisp autumn sun to illuminate the scene of Captain Henry Grayson's inexplicable disappearance. The Skylark, a trim little aircraft with a gleaming fuselage, stood forlorn on the tarmac, its cockpit empty and its scheduled flight to London indefinitely delayed. A small crowd had gathered, villagers curious about the commotion, a handful of passengers, and the police under the steady command of Inspector Craddock. Among them, moving with the unobtrusive grace of a shadow, was Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted slightly against the breeze, her eyes bright with interest. She had arrived at the airfield shortly after her conversation with Mrs. Bantry, her curiosity stirred by the peculiar nature of the case. People, Miss Marple knew, did not vanish without cause, and Captain Grayson's reputation as a punctual, dependable man made his absence all the more intriguing. She stood now near the edge of the tarmac, her hands clasped lightly over her handbag, observing the scene with the quiet intensity of one accustomed to seeing beneath the surface of things. The police were methodical, but Miss Marple's methods were of a different sort, less concerned with fingerprints and more with the subtle tells of human nature. Inspector Craddock, a tall man with a square jaw and a no-nonsense air, was addressing a group of 4 individuals near the hangar. These, Miss Marple deduced from Mrs. Bantry's earlier chatter, were the last to have seen Captain Grayson or to have had reason to be at the airfield that morning. There was Roger Blake, the young co-pilot, whose nervous gestures betrayed a certain unease. Tom Harris, the mechanic, whose gruff demeanor seemed to mask a deeper resentment. Mrs. Clara Wentworth, a passenger whose furs and imperious manner marked her as someone of means. And Edward Vance, a rival pilot from Skyward Ventures, whose easy smile did little to conceal a calculating glint in his eyes. Each, in their way, was a piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple intended to study them closely. She approached Mrs. Bantry, who was hovering near the lounge, her face a mixture of excitement and distress. "Oh, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, clutching her arm. "It's all so dreadful. Arthur's beside himself, says this could ruin the airfield's reputation. And poor Mrs. Grayson, she's at home, quite overcome. The police are questioning everyone, but they've found nothing yet. Not a clue." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand reassuringly. "There are always clues, Dolly, if one knows where to look. Tell me, who are these people the inspector is speaking to? I gather they're the key figures in this little drama." Mrs. Bantry, eager to share, leaned closer. "Well, there's Roger Blake, the co-pilot. Young, a bit jumpy, but Arthur says he's competent enough. He was with Grayson at dawn, checking the flight plan. Then there's Tom Harris, the mechanic. Gruff sort, always tinkering with engines. He serviced the Sky Lark last night and was here this morning. Mrs. Wentworth, that woman in the furs, is a passenger. She's some sort of wealthy widow, always flying off to London for business. And Edward Vance, he's the odd one. He flies for Skyward Ventures, you know, that rival airline up in Much Benham. Arthur says they're struggling, and Vance has been sniffing around our airfield lately. I can't imagine why he was here today, of all days." Miss Marple's eyes followed Mrs. Bantry's gestures, taking in each figure. Roger Blake was pacing near the Sky Lark, his hands thrust into his pockets, his shoulders hunched as if warding off an invisible weight. Tom Harris stood by the hangar, his oil-stained overalls a stark contrast to the polished aircraft behind him, his face set in a scowl as he answered Craddock's questions. Mrs. Wentworth, in the lounge doorway, was tapping her foot impatiently, her fur stole slipping slightly as she gestured to a porter to fetch her bag. Edward Vance, leaning against a fence post, seemed almost amused by the proceedings, his arms crossed and his head tilted as if watching a mildly entertaining play. "A curious assortment," Miss Marple murmured, "each with their own reasons for being here and perhaps their own secrets. I think I shall have a word with the inspector." She moved toward Craddock, her steps slow but purposeful, her appearance so unassuming that few noticed her approach. The inspector, however, knew better than to underestimate the elderly spinster from St. Mary Mead. He tipped his hat as she drew near. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone a mix of respect and mild exasperation. "I might have known you'd turn up. Mrs. Bantry's been filling you in, I suppose?" "Only the barest details," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle, but her eyes sharp. "A missing pilot is no small matter, Inspector. I thought I might observe, if you don't mind. Sometimes an outsider's perspective can be illuminating." Craddock sighed, but there was a hint of a smile. "Observe all you like, but don't go stirring things up. We're trying to keep this orderly." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her expression bland. She stepped back, positioning herself where she could hear the inspector's questions and watch the reactions of those being questioned. Craddock, methodical as ever, was addressing Roger Blake, who stood twisting a cap in his hands. "Mr. Blake," Craddock said, his notebook open, "you say you saw Captain Grayson at dawn, correct? Walk me through it again." Blake swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Yes, sir. I got here around 5:30, as usual. Captain Grayson was already in the cockpit, going over the flight plan. He was particular about that, always checked everything twice. We talked for a bit, just routine stuff. Then I went to the lounge to get coffee. When I came back, maybe 20 minutes later, he was gone. I thought he'd stepped away for a moment, but he never came back. Craddock's pen scratched across the page. And you didn't see anyone else near the plane? No, sir, Blake said quickly, then hesitated. Well, Tom Harris was around earlier, working on the engine, but that was before I got here, and I saw Mrs. Wentworth in the lounge when I got my coffee. She was complaining about the delay already. Miss Marple noted the way Blake's eyes darted toward the hangar, as if checking for someone listening. His nervousness was palpable, but was it guilt, fear, or simply the strain of the moment? She filed the observation away, her mind already turning to the next figure. Craddock moved on to Tom Harris, who stood with his arms crossed, his wrench now tucked into a pocket. "Mr. Harris," Craddock said, "you serviced the Skylark last night. Did you see Captain Grayson this morning?" Harris's jaw tightened. "Aye, I did. He came by around 6, checking my work as he always does. Fussy sort, Grayson. Said everything looked fine, then went off toward the cockpit. I was in the shed after that, sorting tools. Didn't see him again." "You didn't notice anything unusual?" Craddock pressed. "Anyone hanging about who shouldn't have been?" Harris's eyes flicked toward Edward Vance, who was still lounging by the fence. "Well, that Vance fellow was here, wasn't he? Poking around like he owns the place. Don't know what he was doing, but it's not his airfield." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Harris's tone carried a grudge, and his glance at Vance was anything but friendly. Was it professional rivalry or something more personal? She made a mental note to inquire about Harris's history with Grayson and with Vance. Next, Craddock turned to Mrs. Clara Wentworth, who had emerged from the lounge, her fur stole now draped over one arm, her expression one of barely concealed irritation. "Mrs. Wentworth," Craddock said, "you were scheduled to fly to London this morning. When did you last see Captain Grayson?" "I didn't see him at all," she snapped, her voice sharp as cut glass. "I arrived at 7, expecting to board promptly. I've an important meeting in London, Inspector, and this delay is intolerable. I was in the lounge the whole time, waiting for someone to tell me what was going on. If you ask me, this is no accident. Someone's trying to sabotage this flight." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Sabotage, ma'am? That's a strong word. Any reason to think that?" Mrs. Wentworth's eyes narrowed. "I'm in business, Inspector. I know how these things work. There are always competitors waiting to pounce. You might ask that Vance fellow what he was doing here. I saw him near the hangar when I arrived." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Mrs. Wentworth's hands, which clutched her handbag tightly. Her indignation was convincing, but there was a theatrical quality to it, as if she were playing a part. A woman of her sort, Miss Marple thought, might have motives beyond a missed meeting. Money, power, revenge. Any could drive a person to desperate acts. Finally, Craddock approached Edward Vance, who straightened from his slouch against the fence, his smile unwavering. "Mr. Vance," Craddock said, his tone cooler now, "you're a pilot for Skyward Ventures. What brought you to this airfield today?" Vance shrugged, his hands in his pockets. "Just a friendly visit, Inspector. Grayson and I go way back. Flew together years ago before we went our separate ways. I was in the area, thought I'd drop by, see how his operation's doing. No harm in that, is there?" "You were seen near the hangar," Craddock said. "Did you speak to Captain Grayson?" "Didn't get the chance," Vance replied smoothly. "Saw him from a distance, fiddling with his plane. Then I got caught up chatting with one of the groundskeepers. Next thing I know, everyone's in a panic because he's gone." Miss Marple watched Vance closely. His ease was too perfect, his answers too pat. She had known men like him in St. Mary Mead, charming, confident, and often hiding something beneath the surface. His presence at a rival airfield on the very morning of Grayson's disappearance was no coincidence, she was certain. As Craddock continued his questions, Miss Marple drifted toward the skylark, her eyes scanning the ground, the plain, the surrounding area. The tarmac was clean, the grass neatly trimmed, but something caught her attention near the edge of the runway. A faint scuff in the dirt, as if someone had dragged their heel in haste. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple knew that small things often led to larger truths. She returned to Mrs. Bantry, who was watching the proceedings with wide eyes. "Jane, what do you make of it all?" she asked. "Do you think one of them did something to poor Captain Grayson?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but non-committal. "It's early days, Dolly, but people are like skeins of wool, tangled at first, but with a little patience, you can find the thread that unravels everything. I think I shall stay a while longer and see what else comes to light." As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the airfield, Miss Marple settled onto a bench near the lounge, her handbag in her lap, her eyes never still. The four suspects, Blake, Harris, Wentworth, Vance, each had their part to play, their secrets to guard. She would watch and listen and wait. For in the quiet corners of human behavior, where pride and fear and ambition intertwined, the truth would eventually reveal itself. Chapter 3. The Co-Pilot's Secret. The autumn sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the airfield, where the skylark remained grounded, its empty cockpit a silent accusation. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a bench near the lounge, watched the comings and goings with the patience of one, accustomed to unraveling life's knottier threads. The crowd had thinned slightly, with villagers drifting back to their daily routines, but the air still buzzed with tension. Inspector Craddock's men were combing the hangar and maintenance shed, their movements methodical, but to Miss Marple's mind, unlikely to uncover the subtler truths she sought. Her attention was fixed on the four suspects, each of whom had lingered at the airfield, as if tethered by the weight of their own secrets. Roger Blake, the young co-pilot, was her first focus. His nervous demeanor had caught her eye during Craddock's questioning. His twitching fingers, the way his gaze darted toward the hangar, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow despite the cool morning. Miss Marple had seen such signs before, in the young men of St. Mary Mead, who carried burdens they were ill-equipped to hide. There was something about Blake that reminded her of young Tommy Pierce, who had once pilfered apples from her garden, and then confessed under the gentlest of proddings. Guilt, fear, or simple anxiety. She would find out which. She rose from the bench, smoothing her tweed skirt, and made her way toward the small cafe adjacent to the lounge, where Blake had retreated after his interview with Craddock. The cafe was a modest affair, its formica tables and chipped teacups, a far cry from the elegance of Mrs. Bantry's drawing room, but it served its purpose. Blake sat alone at a corner table, staring into a cup of coffee, as if it held the answers to his troubles. Miss Marple approached with her characteristic blend of warmth and unobtrusiveness, her smile as disarming as a grandmother offering a biscuit. "Mr. Blake, she said, settling into the chair opposite him without waiting for an invitation. "You look quite out of sorts. A trying morning, I expect?" Blake started, his coffee sloshing slightly. "Oh, Miss, Marple, isn't it? Yes, it's been, well, awful. Captain Grayson gone, the flight cancelled, everyone looking at me as if I've done something." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes soft but searching. "People do jump to conclusions, don't they? But I find a cup of tea often helps clear the mind. May I?" She signaled the waitress, who brought a pot of tea and a plate of scones. Miss Marple poured a cup with deliberate care, offering one to Blake, who accepted it with a hesitant nod. "You were fond of Captain Grayson, I take it," she said, breaking a scone in two. "A fine pilot by all accounts." Blake's shoulders relaxed slightly, lulled by her kindly tone. "He was the best. Taught me everything I know about flying. Strict, mind you, but fair. Always said you had to respect the machine, or it'd turn on you." "Strict," Miss Marple repeated, her voice musing. "That can be hard on a young man eager to prove himself. I knew a lad once, in St. Mary Mead, who worked for a very exacting baker. Always checking his work, never quite satisfied. It made the boy dreadfully anxious." Blake's fingers tightened around his cup. Grayson wasn't like that. He had high standards, wanted things done right. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "But standards can weigh heavily, can't they? Especially when one hopes for advancement. A co-pilot must dream of captaining his own plane someday." The words were gentle, but they struck a nerve. Blake's face flushed, and he set his cup down with a clink. "I suppose so. Look, I won't lie. Grayson and I had words a few days ago. He said I wasn't ready to take the controls on my own, said I needed more experience. I was angry. But that's all it was, I swear. I'd never do anything to him." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression unchanged. "Angry words are easily spoken, Mr. Blake, and easily regretted. Did you see him again after your disagreement?" Blake hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the window, where the sky lark stood in silent vigil. "Not until this morning, at the airfield. Like I told the inspector, we went over the flight plan, and everything was fine. I didn't think about our argument. It was just work." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind was cataloging every nuance, the pause before his answer, the way his hand trembled as he reached for his scone. Anger, she knew, could smolder, but Blake's distress seemed to stem from something else. Fear, perhaps, or the weight of suspicion. He was young, eager, and vulnerable to pressure. But did that make him a villain? She thought of young Tommy Pierce again, whose petty theft had been driven by a need to impress his peers, not by malice. Blake's motive, if he had one, would be different, but no less human. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "You mustn't let this upset you too much, Mr. Blake. The truth has a way of coming out, you know. But if there's anything troubling you, anything you haven't told the inspector, it might ease your mind to share it. I'm only an old woman, after all. No one minds what I hear." Blake's eyes met hers, and for a moment she thought he might confess something more. But he shook his head, his jaw tightening. "There's nothing else, Miss Marple. I just want Grayson found. He's a good man." Miss Marple smiled, patting his hand. "Of course, my dear. I'm sure he is." She rose, leaving the scone untouched, and made her way back to the tarmac, her mind turning over the encounter. Blake's anger was real, but his fear was more telling. Was he afraid of being found out, or of something, or someone else? Outside, the airfield was quieter now, the police having cordoned off the maintenance shed for a more thorough search. Miss Marple lingered near the skylark, her eyes scanning the ground once more. The scuff mark she had noticed earlier was still there, a faint disturbance in the dirt near the runway's edge. It was not much, but it suggested haste, perhaps struggle. She glanced toward the hangar where Tom Harris was now speaking with a constable, his gestures short and defensive. Mrs. Wentworth had retreated to the lounge, her silhouette visible through the window as she paced. Edward Vance, however, was nowhere to be seen, and Miss Marple made a note of his absence. A man like Vance, she thought, would not linger unless he had a reason. She approached Inspector Craddock, who was reviewing his notes near the control tower. "Any progress, Inspector?" she asked, her tone light. Craddock sighed, closing his notebook. "Not much, Miss Marple. No sign of Grayson, no signs of a struggle, at least not yet. We're searching the shed now, but it's slow going. These people aren't exactly forthcoming." "People rarely are at first," Miss Marple said. "But they do talk in their way. Mr. Blake, for instance, he's a nervous young man, isn't he? I wonder if he's told you everything." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You've been talking to him, have you? He mentioned an argument with Grayson, but insists it was nothing serious. You think he's hiding something?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "I think young men often hide their feelings, Inspector, not always out of guilt, but out of fear. He may know more than he realizes." Craddock frowned, but he knew better than to dismiss her instincts. "I'll keep an eye on him. Any other thoughts?" "Only that this airfield is a busy little place," Miss Marple said, her gaze sweeping the tarmac. "So many people coming and going, and yet no one saw Captain Grayson leave. It's almost as if he was spirited away." She left Craddock to his work, her mind already shifting to the other suspects. Blake's secret, if it was a secret, was only one thread in the tapestry. Harris's resentment, Wentworth's impatience, Vance's opportunism. Each was a strand to be followed. And somewhere, at the heart of it all, was Captain Grayson, whose absence was the knot she must untie. As she made her way back to the bench, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to St. Mary Mead and the many small dramas she had witnessed there. People, she knew, were much the same everywhere. Driven by pride, fear, or ambition, their secrets hidden in plain sight. She would watch and listen, and in time, the truth would reveal itself, as it always did. Chapter 4. The Mechanic's Grudge. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the St. Mary Mead airfield, where the skylark stood idle, its sleek lines a mute testament to the morning's upheaval. The police, under Inspector Craddock's diligent command, continued their methodical search, their voices a low hum against the occasional gust of wind that stirred the grass. Miss Jane Marple, having gleaned what she could from her conversation with Roger Blake, now turned her attention to Tom Harris, the mechanic whose gruff demeanor and oil-stained hands had piqued her interest. She had observed him during Craddock's questioning, noting the defensive hunch of his shoulders and the way his eyes flickered with something that might have been resentment or fear. Miss Marple knew well the type of man Harris represented, the hard-working, prideful sort, fiercely protective of their craft, yet quick to bristle at perceived slights. In St. Mary Mead, she had known old Mr. Hargreaves, the blacksmith, whose temper flared whenever his work was questioned, though his heart was as sound as his anvils. Harris, she suspected, carried a similar pride, and perhaps a grudge that ran deeper than he let on. She found him in the maintenance shed, a cavernous space filled with the sharp scent of oil and metal. Tools hung neatly on pegboards, and a half-dismantled engine sat on a workbench, its parts gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Harris was bent over a propeller blade, polishing it with a rag, his movements precise but forceful, as if he were working off some inner turmoil. Miss Marple paused in the doorway, her straw hat casting a soft shadow across the concrete floor. "Mr. Harris," she said, her voice gentle, but carrying the faintest note of curiosity. "You do keep everything in such splendid order. It must take a great deal of skill to maintain an aircraft like the Skylark." Harris glanced up, his weathered face creasing in a frown. "Aye, it does," he said gruffly, returning to his work. "Not that some folk appreciate it." Miss Marple stepped inside, her hands clasped lightly over her handbag. "Oh, I'm sure Captain Grayson valued your work. A pilot must rely on his mechanic, mustn't he? Like a doctor and his nurse, I always think." Harris snorted, his rag pausing mid-swipe. "Grayson?" He was always poking his nose in, checking my work like I was some apprentice. Last week, he had the nerve to say I'd missed a fault in the engine. Said it could have caused a stall. Nearly cost me my job, that did. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of sympathetic interest. How vexing that must have been. To have one's expertise questioned. It's enough to try anyone's patience. I remember Mrs. Elkins, our village seamstress, was quite put out when a customer doubted her stitching. She was ever so cross, though of course she got over it. Harris's eyes met hers for a moment, then slid away. I got over it too. Didn't have much choice. Grayson's the boss? Well, was, I suppose, but I did my job right. Always have. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. She moved closer, peering at the propeller as if fascinated. "Such intricate machinery. You must know every bolt and screw of that plane. Were you working on it this morning before Captain Grayson vanished?" Harris's hands stilled, and he straightened, wiping his palms on his overalls. "Aye, I was here early, finishing up from last night's service. Grayson came by around 6, like I told the inspector. Checked the engine, said it was fine, then went off to the cockpit. That's the last I saw of him." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the floor, where a faint scuff mark caught her attention, a smudge of dirt near a crate, not unlike the one she'd seen near the runway. "And no one else was about?" she asked. "It's such a quiet place in the early hours, I imagine." Harris shrugged, but his gaze flicked toward the shed's open door. "Just the usual lot. Blake was hanging around, fussing with the flight plan. That Wentworth woman showed up later, making a racket about her schedule. And then there was Vance, strutting about like he owned the place. Never liked him myself. Too slick by half." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Mr. Vance does seem rather confident. I suppose rivalry between airlines can be quite fierce. Did he ever cause trouble here before?" Harris's jaw tightened, and he tossed the rag onto the workbench. "He's always sniffing around, asking questions about our planes, our schedules. Says it's just friendly interest, but I don't buy it. Skyward Ventures is on its last legs. Everyone knows that. Grayson's flights were taking their business, and Vance didn't like it one bit." Miss Marple made a soft, thoughtful sound, her mind cataloging Harris's words. His resentment toward Grayson was clear, but his suspicion of Vance was equally telling. Was it genuine or a convenient deflection? She thought of Mr. Hargreaves again, whose grumbling about a rival blacksmith had masked a deeper fear of losing custom. Harris's pride in his work was evident, but pride, she knew, could curdle into something darker when wounded. "You must find it trying, working under such scrutiny," she said, her voice warm with understanding. "A man of your experience deserves trust. Tell me, Mr. Harris, did Captain Grayson often check your work so closely? Or was last week's incident unusual?" Harris hesitated, his fingers curling around the edge of the workbench. He was always particular, but lately he was worse. Kept saying we couldn't afford mistakes, not with skyward ventures breathing down our necks. I told him I knew my job, but he wouldn't let up. Made me feel like I was under a microscope. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was sharp, noting the edge in his voice. "It's hard to feel mistrusted," she said. "I knew a gardener once, in St. Mary Mead, who took great offense when his employer questioned his pruning. He was quite put out, but he'd never have dreamed of doing harm. I'm sure it's the same with you." Harris flushed, his scowl deepening. "Course I wouldn't harm him. I need this job. Got a family to feed. Grayson's a pain, but he's a good pilot. Was, I mean." He caught himself, his eyes narrowing. "Look, I don't know what happened to him. I just want to get back to work." Miss Marple nodded, her smile unwavering. "And so you shall, Mr. Harris. These things have a way of sorting themselves out." She turned to leave, pausing at the door to glance back. "Oh, one more thing. Did you happen to notice anything near the runway this morning? A dropped item, perhaps, or signs of someone in a hurry?" Harris shook his head, but his hesitation was brief, almost imperceptible. "Didn't see nothing, just did my job and kept my head down." Miss Marple thanked him and stepped back into the sunlight, her mind whirring. Harris's grudge was real, and his dislike of Vance was unmistakable, but his defensiveness suggested more than professional pride. Was he hiding a small act of spite, or something graver? The scuff mark in the shed nagged at her, its similarity to the one near the runway suggesting a connection she could not yet place. She made her way toward the lounge, where Mrs. Bantry was waiting, her face alight with curiosity. "Jane, you've been talking to that Harris fellow," she said, lowering her voice. "What did you make of him? He's a rough sort, isn't he?" "Rough, perhaps," Miss Marple replied, "but not without his reasons. Men like Mr. Harris take pride in their work, and pride can be a delicate thing. I wonder, Dolly, have you heard any talk in the village about Mr. Harris and Captain Grayson? Any disagreements?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Well, now that you mention it, the barmaid at the Blue Boar did say Harris was grumbling about Grayson a few nights ago. Something about being treated like a fool. But that's just pub talk, isn't it?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Pub talk often holds a grain of truth, Dolly. I think I shall keep an eye on Mr. Harris, and on that Mr. Vance, too. There's a thread here, and I mean to follow it." As she settled back onto her bench, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the broader tapestry of the case. Blake's nervousness, Harris's resentment, Wentworth's impatience, Vance's opportunism. Each was a strand, interwoven with the mystery of Grayson's disappearance. The scuff marks, the cigarette case she would later find, the whispers of rivalry. They were all pieces of a puzzle that, with patience, she would assemble. For now, she would watch and listen, trusting that human nature, with all its flaws and frailties, would lead her to the truth. Chapter 5. The Passenger's Motive. The afternoon had deepened over the St. Mary Mead airfield, the sun now dipping toward the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of amber and rose. The skylark stood motionless on the tarmac, its polished surface reflecting the fading light, a silent reminder of Captain Grayson's absence. The police, under Inspector Craddock's steady direction, continued their search, their voices a low murmur, as they combed the perimeter of the airfield. Miss Jane Marple, having gleaned insights from her conversations with Roger Blake and Tom Harris, now turned her attention to Mrs. Clara Wentworth, the wealthy passenger whose sharp tongue and impatient demeanor had marked her as a figure of interest. Miss Marple had observed her earlier, pacing in the lounge doorway, her fur stole slipping from her shoulders as she berated a porter. There was something about Mrs. Wentworth's indignation that struck Miss Marple as calculated, a performance designed to deflect rather than reveal. Mrs. Wentworth was still in the lounge, seated now on a cushioned bench, her posture rigid despite the softness of her surroundings. The lounge itself was a modest space, its walls adorned with faded posters of far-off destinations, its tables cluttered with dog-eared magazines and chipped teacups. Mrs. Wentworth, with her expensive furs and gleaming pearl earrings, seemed out of place, a peacock among sparrows. Miss Marple approached with her usual unassuming grace, her straw hat tilted slightly against the glare streaming through the lounge's wide windows. "Mrs. Wentworth," she said, her voice warm and deferential, "I do hope you're managing under these trying circumstances. It must be dreadfully inconvenient, this delay." Mrs. Wentworth's eyes, sharp and appraising, flicked up from the magazine she held, but did not read. "Inconvenient is putting it mildly," she snapped, her tone as crisp as her tailored coat. "I've a critical meeting in London tomorrow, and this nonsense with Captain Grayson has thrown everything into chaos. I paid good money for a prompt departure, and now I'm stranded in this backwater." Miss Marple settled onto the bench opposite, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. "How vexing," she said sympathetically. "I understand you're in business, Mrs. Wentworth. It must be terribly important to require such urgency." Mrs. Wentworth's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained wary. "Property development," she said, adjusting her stole. "I'm negotiating a deal for a new estate in Mayfair. Every hour I'm delayed, my competitors gain ground. You wouldn't understand, Miss Marple," Miss Marple supplied, her smile disarming. "Oh, I'm just a simple village spinster, but I do know how fierce competition can be. In St. Mary Mead, we've our own little rivalries, over rose gardens and jam recipes, you know. But I imagine your world is far more cutthroat." Mrs. Wentworth gave a short, mirthless laugh. "Cutthroat is the word. There are people who'd do anything to see me fail. This delay feels like more than an accident, if you ask me. Someone's behind it." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, her expression one of polite curiosity. "A bold claim, Mrs. Wentworth. Do you have someone in mind? A business rival, perhaps?" Mrs. Wentworth's lips tightened, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I wouldn't be surprised if that Vance fellow had something to do with it. He was lurking about this morning, near the hangar. His airline's on its last legs, and Grayson's success was a thorn in his side. I've seen his type before, smiling, charming, and ruthless." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the accusation. Mrs. Wentworth's words echoed Tom Harris's suspicions of Edward Vance, but there was a rehearsed quality to her delivery, as if she were testing the waters. Mr. Vance does seem rather self-assured, Miss Marple said. But surely a man in his position wouldn't stoop to such drastic measures. Or do you think otherwise? Mrs. Wentworth hesitated, her fingers tightening on her handbag. I don't know what to think, she admitted, but I saw him near the Sky Lark this morning, before all this began. He had no business being there. And Grayson, well, he was always so reliable. It's not like him to just vanish. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes soft but piercing. You knew Captain Grayson well, then. I suppose a frequent passenger like yourself would come to trust him. Mrs. Wentworth shrugged, her gaze sliding away. Well enough. He was professional. Always got me to London on time. But I didn't know him personally, if that's what you mean. I'm not one for idle chatter with pilots. There was a defensiveness in her tone that Miss Marple noted, like a seamstress spotting a loose thread. Mrs. Wentworth's indignation was convincing, but her quickness to point fingers at Vance suggested more than mere suspicion. Was she genuinely convinced of his guilt, or was she steering attention away from herself? Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Carter, a St. Mary Mead widow, who had once loudly accused a neighbor of stealing her silver, only to later admit she'd misplaced it. Deflection, she knew, was a common tactic among those with something to hide. You must have been in the lounge all morning, then, Miss Marple said, her voice light. Waiting for the flight, I mean. It's such a small airfield. One notices everyone coming and going. Mrs. Wentworth's eyes narrowed slightly. I arrived at 7, as I told the inspector. I was in the lounge, waiting for the boarding call. I didn't see Grayson, but I saw Blake, that nervous co-pilot, fetching coffee. And Harris was in and out of the hangar, as usual. Then Vance showed up, looking far too pleased with himself. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the timeline. Mrs. Wentworth's account aligned with Blake's and Harris's, but her emphasis on Vance was striking. It's curious, isn't it, she mused, how everyone seems to have been in just the right place to see nothing, or perhaps too much. Did you notice anything else, Mrs. Wentworth? A sound, perhaps, or something out of place? Mrs. Wentworth frowned, her fingers drumming on her handbag. Nothing specific, just a feeling. This place was too quiet this morning, like everyone was holding their breath. And then, when Grayson didn't show, it was chaos. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her thoughts were racing. Mrs. Wentworth's feeling was vague, yet it echoed her own sense of the airfield's unnatural stillness. She recalled the scuff mark near the runway, the faint smudge in the maintenance shed, small signs of haste or struggle. Mrs. Wentworth, with her wealth and influence, had the means to orchestrate trouble. But did she have the motive? A delayed flight was an inconvenience, but Miss Marple suspected there was more to Mrs. Wentworth's urgency than a business meeting. She rose, smoothing her skirt. You've been most kind to indulge an old woman's questions, Mrs. Wentworth. I do hope your meeting in London goes well, once this is all sorted. Mrs. Wentworth's expression softened, though her eyes remained guarded. Thank you, Miss Marple. I just want this resolved. It's bad enough being stuck here without being treated like a suspect. Of course, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. These things have a way of coming clear. She left the lounge, her steps slow but purposeful, and made her way toward the tarmac, where Inspector Craddock was conferring with a constable. The scuff mark near the runway was still there, undisturbed by the police's search, and she paused to study it, her mind weaving connections. Mrs. Bantry, ever vigilant, hurried over, her face alight with curiosity. "Jane, you've been talking to that Wentworth woman. What did you make of her? She's a bit grand, isn't she?" "Grand indeed," Miss Marple replied, her eyes still on the scuff mark. "But grand people often have grand secrets, Dolly. Mrs. Wentworth is quick to blame Mr. Vance, and that interests me. I wonder if she's protecting herself or someone else." Mrs. Bantry gasped. "You don't think she had something to do with it, do you?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "I think everyone has something to hide, Dolly, until proven otherwise. But I shall keep watching. The truth, you know, is like a garden weed. It always finds a way to the surface." As she returned to her bench, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the broader puzzle. Blake's fear, Harris's resentment, Wentworth's deflection, Vance's confidence. Each was a piece, but the picture remained incomplete. The scuff marks, the cigarette case she would soon discover, the whispers of rivalry. They were all threads in a tapestry she was determined to unravel. For now, she would wait, her eyes and ears open, trusting that human nature would, as always, betray its secrets. Chapter 6. The Rival's Ambition. The St. Mary Mead airfield lay bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon, the sky now a tapestry of deepening blues and golds as the sun edged toward the horizon. The Skylark remained grounded, its empty cockpit a stark reminder of Captain Grayson's absence. The police had widened their search, their figures moving methodically across the tarmac and into the surrounding fields, but their efforts seemed to yield little. Miss Jane Marple, seated once more on her bench near the lounge, watched the scene with her characteristic quiet intensity, her knitting needles idle in her lap. Her conversations with Roger Blake, Tom Harris, and Mrs. Clara Wentworth had woven a complex web of motives and suspicions, but one figure stood out in her mind. Edward Vance, the rival pilot whose polished charm and casual presence at the airfield struck her as anything but coincidental. Vance had vanished from the tarmac after Inspector Craddock's initial questioning, a fact that Miss Marple found telling. Men like Vance, she knew, were rarely absent without purpose. In St. Mary Mead, she had encountered his type before. Men like Mr. Langley, the estate agent, whose smooth manners masked a ruthless streak when it came to securing a deal. Vance's airline, Skyward Ventures, was rumored to be faltering, and Grayson's success was a direct threat. Ambition, Miss Marple mused, was a powerful force capable of driving men to desperate acts. She rose, adjusting her straw hat, and made her way toward the hangar, where she had last seen Vance leaning against a fence post, his smile as sharp as a blade. The hangar was quieter now, the police having shifted their focus to the maintenance shed and the runway's edge. A young groundskeeper sweeping the tarmac caught her eye, and she paused to exchange a few words, her tone as warm and unassuming as ever. "Good afternoon, young man," she said, smiling. "You must be terribly busy with all this commotion. Tell me, do you know Mr. Vance, the pilot from Skyward Ventures? I saw him here earlier, but he seems to have slipped away." The groundskeeper, a lanky lad named Peter, paused, leaning on his broom. "Oh, Mr. Vance? Aye, he's been around a few times lately. Always chatting, asking about the Skylark, how often it flies, that sort of thing. This morning, he was near the hangar, talking to one of the mechanics before the police showed up. Seemed in a hurry to leave after that." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained placid. How interesting. And did he seem Friendly with Captain Grayson? Peter shrugged. Didn't see them together, ma'am, but Mr. Vance always had a smile, you know, like he was sizing things up. My dad says Skyward's in trouble, and Grayson's flights were stealing their passengers. Miss Marple nodded, thanking the boy before continuing toward the hangar. The groundskeeper's words confirmed what she had suspected. Vance's presence was no casual visit. She recalled Mrs. Wentworth's accusation and Harris's distrust, both pointing to Vance as a potential orchestrator of Grayson's disappearance. But suspicion, she knew, was not proof, and Vance's charm made him a slippery figure to pin down. Inside the hangar, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of metal and fuel. A single aircraft, not the Skylark, stood in the shadows, its wings casting long silhouettes across the concrete floor. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the space, noting the neatly arranged tools and the faint traces of oil on the ground. Near the far wall, a stack of crates caught her attention, not for their contents, but for a small detail, a smudge of dirt on the floor, similar to the scuff marks she had seen near the runway and in the maintenance shed. It was faint, but it suggested movement, perhaps hurried, perhaps concealed. As she pondered this, a shadow moved at the hangar's entrance, and Edward Vance himself appeared, his hands in his pockets, his smile as easy as ever. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said, his voice smooth as polished wood. "Fancy meeting you here. Taking an interest in aviation, are you?" Miss Marple turned, her expression one of mild surprise. "Mr. Vance, how kind of you to notice an old woman. No, I'm no expert in aviation, but I do find people fascinating, and airfields seem to attract such interesting sorts. You, for instance, why are you here today, when your own airline is in much Benham?" Vance's smile didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed slightly, assessing her. "Just paying a visit, as I told the inspector. Grayson and I are old mates, flew together in the early days. Thought I'd drop by, see how his little operation's doing. No harm in that, surely." Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze steady. "None at all, if it's just a friendly visit. But I hear Skyward Ventures is struggling, and Captain Grayson's success must be inconvenient. I knew a gentleman once, in St. Mary Mead, who ran a shop that outdid his rivals. The rival was quite put out, you know, did some rather unkind things to even the score." Vance laughed, a low, easy sound. "You're a sharp one, aren't you? Yes, Grayson's doing well, and good for him. But I'm not the type to play dirty tricks. I was here this morning, had a quick word with a mechanic, then left when the fuss started. Nothing more to it." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her mind was alert, catching the casual dismissal in his tone. "A mechanic, you say? Not Mr. Harris, I presume. He didn't seem fond of you." Vance's grin widened, but it was a touch too tight. "Not Harris, no. Another fellow, just passing the time. Look, Miss Marple, I know how this looks, but I had no reason to harm Grayson. Rivalry's one thing, sabotage is another. I'm a pilot, not a criminal." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. "But it's curious, isn't it, how you were seen near the hangar, and then Captain Grayson vanished so suddenly. I suppose you didn't notice anything unusual this morning? A sound, perhaps, or someone in a hurry?" Vance's eyes flicked toward the crates, so briefly she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching. "Nothing out of the ordinary," he said. "Just the usual airfield bustle. Grayson was at his plane, Blake was fussing about, Harris was in his shed. I didn't see Mrs. Wentworth, but I hear she was making a scene in the lounge." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. Vance's account was smooth, almost rehearsed, and his glance at the crates had not escaped her. Was it a guilty reflex or merely distraction? She thought of Mr. Langley again, whose charm had hidden a penchant for underhanded deals. Vance's ambition, she suspected, was a driving force, and ambition could twist even the most charming soul. She stepped back, her hands clasped over her handbag. "You've been most kind to humor me, Mr. Vance. I do hope Captain Grayson is found soon. It's such a worry for us all." Vance tipped his hat, his smile returning to its full brilliance. "I'm sure he'll turn up, Miss Marple. These things usually do." He sauntered off, his stride too casual, leaving her alone in the hangar. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes returning to the smudge on the floor. It was faint, but it matched the marks she had seen. Elsewhere, a pattern, perhaps, of someone moving quickly, dragging something heavy. She made a mental note to mention it to Craddock, though she suspected the police would overlook such subtleties. Her thoughts turned to Vance's words, his easy dismissal of suspicion, his quickness to name others. He was clever, she thought, but cleverness often betrayed itself. She left the hangar and found Mrs. Bantry near the lounge, her face alight with curiosity. "Jane, you've been talking to that Vance fellow," she exclaimed. "What did you make of him? He's awfully smooth, isn't he?" "Smooth indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone thoughtful. "But smooth surfaces often hide cracks, Dolly. Mr. Vance has ambition, and ambition can be a dangerous thing. I think I shall ask the inspector to keep a close eye on him." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You think he's involved? Oh, Jane, this is getting positively thrilling." Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Thrilling, perhaps, but also troubling. There's a pattern here, Dolly, and I mean to find it." As she settled back onto her bench, her mind wove together the threads. Blake's fear, Harris's grudge, Wentworth's deflection, and now Vance's ambition. The scuff marks, the whispers of rivalry, the tension in the air. They were all leading somewhere, and Miss Marple was determined to follow. Chapter 7. A Clue in the Grass. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the St. Mary Meade airfield bathed in the soft violet glow of twilight. The skylark stood sentinel on the tarmac, its silhouette sharp against the fading light, a mute witness to the mystery of Captain Grayson's disappearance. The police, under Inspector Craddock's steady guidance, had expanded their search to the fields beyond the runway, their torches flickering like fireflies in the gathering dusk. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat now tucked into her handbag, lingered near the edge of the tarmac, her eyes scanning the ground with the quiet precision of one accustomed to finding significance in the smallest details. Her conversations with Roger Blake, Tom Harris, Mrs. Clara Wentworth, and Edward Vance had painted a vivid picture of motives and tensions, but it was the physical traces of the morning's events that now drew her attention. She had noticed the scuff marks, first near the runway, then in the maintenance shed, and again in the hangar. Each was a subtle disturbance, a hint of haste or struggle, and Miss Marple was certain they held a key to the puzzle. People, she knew, could lie with words, but the earth rarely did. In St. Mary Meade, she had once solved a theft by noting a smudged footprint in a flower bed left by a careless poacher. Here, too, she trusted the ground to tell its story. As she strolled along the runway's edge, her sensible shoes silent on the grass, a glint caught her eye, a metallic shimmer half hidden among the blades. She bent down, her movements slow to avoid drawing attention, and retrieved a small silver cigarette case, its surface engraved with the initials HG. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly as she turned it over in her hands, noting a faint scratch along one edge, as if it had been dropped or thrown. It was Captain Grayson's, she was certain. Mrs. Bantry had mentioned his habit of carrying such a case, a gift from his wife. She glanced around, ensuring no one was watching, and tucked the case into her handbag. The spot where it lay was near the maintenance shed, a good distance from the Skylark's cockpit, where Grayson had last been seen. Curious, she murmured to herself, that it should be here, of all places. The grass around it was slightly flattened, and there again was a scuff mark, deeper than the others, as if something, or someone, had been dragged across the ground. Miss Marple straightened, her mind racing. The cigarette case was a tangible clue, a thread in the tapestry she was weaving. It suggested Grayson had been near the shed, perhaps unexpectedly, and the scuff mark hinted at a struggle or a hurried departure. She thought of the suspects, Blake's nervousness, Harris's resentment, Wentworth's deflection, Vance's ambition. Any of them could have been here, but the case's presence pointed to a moment of carelessness, a mistake made in haste. She made her way toward Inspector Craddock, who was standing near the control tower, his face etched with the frustration of a long day's fruitless search. "Inspector," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I've found something you might wish to see." Craddock turned, his eyebrows lifting. "Miss Marple, you're full of surprises. What is it?" She produced the cigarette case, holding it carefully by its edges. "This was in the grass, near the maintenance shed. I believe it belongs to Captain Grayson. And there's a mark nearby, a scuff, rather like the ones I noticed earlier. It might be worth examining." Craddock took the case, his expression sharpening. "Grayson's, you say? Odd place for it to turn up. And you say there's a scuff mark?" Miss Marple nodded. "Quite distinct, Inspector. It suggests someone moved quickly, perhaps dragging something. I found similar marks in the shed and near the runway. They may be nothing, of course, but I thought you should know." Craddock's lips twitched in a reluctant smile. "You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple. We'll have a look. If this is Grayson's, it could narrow down where he was last." He called over a constable, instructing him to mark the spot and examine the shed more closely. "Anything else you've noticed?" he asked, his tone half teasing, half respectful. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Only that people are rarely as careful as they think, Inspector. A dropped cigarette case, a scuffed patch of ground. These things tell a story, if one listens." Craddock nodded, pocketing the case. "I'll have it checked for prints, and we'll take a closer look at the shed. You're sure you don't want to join the force, Miss Marple?" She laughed softly, a sound like the rustle of leaves. "Oh, I'm far too old for that, Inspector. But I do enjoy a puzzle, and this one is proving most intriguing." As Craddock moved off to direct his men, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze returning to the shed. Its door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness within. She recalled Harris's defensive tone, his claim of being in the shed all morning, sorting tools. Had he seen Grayson there? Or had someone else, Vance, perhaps with his calculating smile, used the shed as a hiding place? The scuff marks suggested movement, possibly a struggle, and the cigarette case suggested Grayson's presence. But why here, so far from the cockpit? Miss Marple thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, years ago, when a missing brooch had been found in a hedgerow, dropped by a thief in flight. The brooch had led her to the culprit, a maid with a grudge against her employer. This cigarette case, she suspected, was a similar beacon, pointing not just to Grayson's last moments, but to the person who had ensured his absence. She made her way back to the lounge, where Mrs. Bantry was waiting, her face alight with anticipation. "Jane, you've been poking about again," she exclaimed, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "What did you find? Something dreadful, I'll bet." Miss Marple smiled, settling onto a bench. "Not dreadful, Dolly, but certainly curious. A cigarette case belonging to Captain Grayson left in the grass near the shed, and a scuff mark, suggesting someone was in a hurry. It's a small thing, but small things often lead to larger truths." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "A clue? Oh, Jane, you're marvelous. Do you think it points to one of them? Blake, or Harris, or that Wentworth woman, or Vance?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle clicking, retrieved from her handbag. "It points to someone, Dolly, but we mustn't jump to conclusions. Each of them has their reasons, their secrets. Mr. Blake's fear, Mr. Harris's grudge, Mrs. Wentworth's impatience, Mr. Vance's ambition. They're all threads in the same tapestry. We need only find the right one to pull." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping. "But you suspect someone, don't you? I can tell by that look in your eye." Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "I suspect everyone, Dolly, until the truth proves otherwise. For now, I shall watch and listen. The airfield has more to tell us, I'm sure of it." As twilight deepened into night, Miss Marple remained on her bench, her thoughts weaving together the clues, the scuff marks, the cigarette case, the suspects' shifting stories. Each was a piece of the puzzle, and though the picture was still unclear, she felt the truth drawing closer, like a shadow, moving into the light. Chapter 8. The Village. Gossip. The night had settled over St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a velvet darkness pierced only by the soft glow of street lamps and the occasional flicker of a cottage window. The airfield, now quiet save for the distant murmur of a police constable on watch, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the mystery of Captain Grayson's disappearance to unravel. Miss Jane Marple, having returned to her cozy cottage at Danemead, sat by her hearth, the fire casting dancing shadows across the familiar contours of her parlor. Her knitting lay untouched on the table, for her mind was too occupied with the day's findings, the cigarette case, the scuff marks, and the tangled motives of the 4 suspects. Yet she knew that the airfield, with its comings and goings, was only part of the story. The village itself, with its web of gossip and half-truths, often held the keys to secrets that even the police overlooked. Miss Marple understood the power of village talk. In St. Mary Mead, where every glance and whisper carried weight, the truth often surfaced in the most mundane conversations, over teacups at the post office, in the queue at the baker's, or in the hushed confidences of the Blue Boar's taproom. She recalled a case years ago when a whispered rumor about a missing locket had led her to a jealous housemaid. Now, with Captain Grayson vanished and suspicion hanging over the airfield, she resolved to tap into the village's undercurrent of chatter. The suspects, Roger Blake, Tom Harris, Mrs. Clara Wentworth, and Edward Vance, might guard their secrets at the airfield, but in St. Mary Mead, tongues were looser. The next morning, Miss Marple set out early, her straw hat firmly in place, her handbag swinging lightly at her side. The village was stirring, its narrow lanes alive with the clatter of milk bottles and the hum of morning greetings. Her first stop was the post office, where Mrs. Price, the postmistress, presided with the omniscience of one who handled every letter and parcel in the village. Mrs. Price was a wiry woman, with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, and Miss Marple knew her to be a fount of local knowledge, provided one approached her with the right blend of deference and curiosity. "Good morning, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said, stepping into the post office's cramped interior, where the air smelled of ink and wax. "Such a lovely day, isn't it? Though I hear there's been quite a stir at the airfield." Mrs. Price's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles as she sorted a stack of envelopes. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's a proper scandal. Captain Grayson vanishing like that. Poof, gone. Everyone's talking about it. I had Mrs. Grayson in here yesterday, poor thing, buying stamps and looking like she'd seen a ghost. Said she hadn't slept a wink." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, leaning on the counter. "Poor woman. It must be dreadful, not knowing where he is. I suppose the village has its own ideas about what happened." Mrs. Price lowered her voice, glancing toward the door to ensure no one was listening. "Plenty of ideas, Miss Marple. Some say Grayson ran off, debts maybe, or a woman, though I don't believe that. He's too steady. Others think it's that Vance fellow from Skyward Ventures. I saw him myself, you know, the night before last, near the church. He was meeting someone in a dark car, looking shifty as you please. Didn't like the look of it at all." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, though her expression remained mild. "Mr. Vance, you say? How curious. And this was near the church, at night?" 8 o'clock or thereabouts, Mrs. Price said, nodding vigorously. "I was coming back from choir practice. Couldn't see who he was with, but they were talking low, like they didn't want to be overheard. I told my husband, that's not the sort of thing an honest man does." Miss Marple made a soft, thoughtful sound. "Indeed, men like Mr. Vance do have a way of attracting attention. I suppose no one else was seen acting oddly. Mr. Harris, perhaps, or young Mr. Blake?" Mrs. Price's lips pursed. "Well, Tom Harris was in a state at the Blue Boar a few nights ago, so my nephew says, grumbling about Grayson, saying he'd been treated like a fool over some engine trouble. Sounded like he'd had a pint too many. As for Blake, he keeps to himself, but he's been jumpy lately, always looking over his shoulder. My nephew reckons he's scared of something." Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Price, purchasing a few stamps to maintain the pretense of her visit, and stepped back into the morning light. The postmistress's words had added new threads to her tapestry. Vance's clandestine meeting, Harris's drunken complaints, Blake's nervous demeanor. She thought of Edward Vance, with his polished charm and calculating eyes, meeting a stranger under cover of darkness. It was the sort of behavior that suggested planning, perhaps conspiracy. Harris's pub talk, meanwhile, confirmed his resentment. But was it enough to drive him to action? And Blake's fear, what was its source? Her next stop was the Blue Boar, the village pub where gossip flowed as freely as the ale. The taproom was quiet in the morning, save for the clink of glasses as Sally, the barmaid, polished the counter. Sally was a cheerful young woman with a knack for remembering conversations, and Miss Marple knew her to be a reliable source, provided one asked the right questions. "Good morning, Sally," Miss Marple said, settling onto a stool with a smile. "I thought I'd stop in for a cup of tea. It's been quite a week, hasn't it, with all this trouble at the airfield?" Sally's eyes lit up as she poured the tea. "Oh, Miss Marple, It's the talk of the village. Captain Grayson gone just like that. Everyone's got a theory. Some say he's run off to France, but I don't believe it. He's not the type." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression encouraging. "No, he doesn't seem the sort to run. I hear Mr. Harris was in here recently, speaking about Captain Grayson. He must be terribly worried." Sally snorted, wiping her hands on her apron. "Worried? More like angry. He was here 3 nights ago, after a few pints, going on about Grayson. Said he'd been made to look a fool over some engine fault. Kept saying he'd teach him a lesson, though I reckon it was the ale talking. Tom's all bluster when he's had a drink." Miss Marple's needles, retrieved from her handbag, began their gentle clicking. "How interesting. And I suppose no one else from the airfield was here. Mr. Vance, perhaps, or Mr. Blake." "Not Blake," Sally said, shaking her head. "He's not one for pubs, but Vance was in last week, chatting up some of the locals, buying rounds. Seemed friendly, but my dad says he's got no business hanging about our airfield. Reckon he's jealous of Grayson's success." Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving the new information into the pattern. Vance's presence in the village, his meeting by the church, Harris's threats, Blake's absence. They were all pieces, but the picture remained elusive. She thanked Sally, leaving a generous tip, and stepped back into the lane, her thoughts turning to the cigarette case and the scuff marks. The village gossip had confirmed her suspicions. Vance was plotting something, Harris was nursing a grudge, and Blake was afraid. But of what? Or whom? She returned to Danemead, where Mrs. Bantry was waiting, her face alight with anticipation. "Jane, you've been out gathering gossip, haven't you?" she said, pouring tea. "What did you find? Something juicy, I hope." Miss Marple smiled, settling into her armchair. "Juicy, perhaps, but also troubling, Dolly. The village is buzzing with talk. Mr. Vance meeting strangers in the dark, Mr. Harris muttering threats, Mr. Blake looking frightened. It's a puzzle, and each piece brings us closer to the truth." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes wide. "You think one of them did it, don't you?" "Oh, Jane, who's your money on?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "I don't wager on such things, Dolly, but I do watch and listen. The village has spoken, and now I must think. The truth, you see, is like a stubborn knot. It takes patience to untie." As she picked up her knitting, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the airfield, the scuff marks, the cigarette case, and the suspect's tangled motives. The village gossip had added depth to her picture, but the final piece was still missing. She would wait, as she always did, for the moment when human nature revealed its secrets. Chapter 9. The Hidden Motive. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's parlor in Danemead Cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where her knitting lay neglected. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, a counterpoint to the quiet hum of St. Mary Mead waking beyond her window. The mystery of Captain Grayson's disappearance had consumed her thoughts since yesterday's discoveries. The silver cigarette case, the scuff marks, and the village gossip that painted a vivid picture of suspicion and rivalry. Miss Marple knew that the airfield's secrets were interwoven with the ambitions and grievances of its people, and she was determined to uncover the thread that tied them together. Her conversations with Roger Blake, Tom Harris, Mrs. Clara Wentworth, and Edward Vance had revealed much, but it was the broader context, the business of the airfield itself, that now drew her focus. Miss Marple understood that motives often lay hidden in the mundane details of daily life. In St. Mary Mead, she had once unraveled a case of blackmail by examining a grocer's ledger, which revealed payments no one had thought to question. Now, she suspected that the airfield's records might hold a clue to Captain Grayson's fate. With Mrs. Bantry's help, whose husband held a stake in the airfield, Miss Marple arranged to visit the small office where the business's accounts and schedules were kept. The office, tucked behind the control tower, was a cramped space filled with the musty scent of old paper and the faint tang of ink. Files were stacked haphazardly on a desk, and a typewriter sat unused, its keys dusty from neglect. Mrs. Bantry, bustling with excitement, met her there, her cheeks flushed from the morning chill. "Jane, I've convinced Arthur to let us look at the books," she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "He's terribly worried about the airfield's reputation, you know. Says this business with Grayson could scare off passengers for good, but I told him you'd sort it out." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes already scanning the cluttered desk. "You're too kind, Dolly. I'm no accountant, but I do find that numbers often tell stories people try to hide. Let's see what we can find." The two women set to work, Mrs. Bantry pulling files with the enthusiasm of a child opening presents, while Miss Marple examined them with the precision of a seamstress, inspecting stitches. The records were a patchwork of invoices, flight schedules, and passenger manifests. But what caught Miss Marple's attention was a series of financial reports comparing the airfield's performance to that of its rival, Skyward Ventures. The figures were stark. Grayson's flights operated under the Saint. Mary Mead Air Service had seen a steady increase in passengers and revenue over the past year, while Skyward Ventures, based in Much Benham, was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Recent bookings showed that several high-profile clients, including Mrs. Wentworth, had switched from Skyward to Grayson's service, drawn by his reputation for reliability. "This is most illuminating," Miss Marple murmured, her finger tracing a column of numbers. Captain Grayson's success was not just a matter of pride. It was a direct threat to Skyward Ventures. If they were to lose more clients, they might not recover. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You mean Mr. Vance? Do you think he did something to Grayson to save his airline?" Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful, her hands folded over the open file. "Mr. Vance has ambition, Dolly, and ambition can be a dangerous thing. A single scandal, a missing pilot, a grounded flight, could ruin Grayson's reputation and drive passengers back to Skyward Ventures. It's the sort of plan a desperate man might devise." She turned to another file, this one detailing maintenance logs. Tom Harris's name appeared frequently, his meticulous notes documenting every repair and inspection on the Skylark. But one entry, dated a week ago, stood out. A report of an engine fault, flagged by Grayson himself, with a note that Harris had been reprimanded for overlooking it. The incident matched Harris's account of his argument with Grayson, but the severity of the reprimand, a formal warning logged in the records, suggested a deeper rift than Harris had admitted. "Mr. Harris was not pleased about this, I imagine," Miss Marple said, tapping the page. "A man's pride in his work is a fragile thing, and to be publicly corrected, it might fester." Mrs. Bantry leaned over, peering at the file. "You think Harris might have done something out of spite? But he needs his job, Jane. Surely he wouldn't risk it." Miss Marple's smile was faint. "People act against their own interests when their emotions are stirred, Dolly. I knew a cook once, in St. Mary Mead, who spoiled a whole dinner out of pique when her mistress criticized her soup. Mr. Harris might not have planned anything drastic, but a moment of anger can lead to unexpected consequences. She moved on to the passenger manifests, noting Mrs. Wentworth's frequent flights to London. Her name appeared alongside others, but a pattern emerged. Her bookings coincided with key business meetings, and delays had cost her opportunities in the past. Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Wentworth's insistence that the delay was sabotage, her quickness to point to Vance. Was it genuine suspicion or a calculated move to deflect attention? The manifests offered no direct answers, but they underscored Mrs. Wentworth's stake in the airfield's reliability. As for Roger Blake, the records showed him as a diligent co-pilot, but with no indication of promotion or advancement. His argument with Grayson, mentioned during their tea at the cafe, suggested a young man eager to prove himself but held back by his mentor's exacting standards. Could frustration have driven him to act? Miss Marple thought of young Tommy Pierce again, whose petty theft had been a cry for attention. Blake's fear, she suspected, was not just of suspicion, but of failure. Mrs. Bantry, growing restless, interrupted her thoughts. "Jane, you're awfully quiet. Have you found something? You've got that look, like you're piecing together a jigsaw." Miss Marple closed the file, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "I've found a pattern, Dolly. Mr. Vance stands to gain the most from Grayson's disappearance. His airline is failing, and a scandal here could save it. But he'd need help, someone familiar with the airfield's routines. Mr. Harris, perhaps, with his grudge, or even Mr. Blake, though I doubt he has the nerve. Mrs. Wentworth, too, might have reasons we haven't yet seen. The cigarette case, the scuff marks, they point to the maintenance shed and someone who acted quickly." Mrs. Bantry gasped. "You think Vance planned it? With Harris, maybe?" "Oh, Jane, it's like something out of a novel." Miss Marple's smile was gentle but firm. "Life is often stranger than novels, Dolly. But we must be careful. These are only threads, not proof. I think I shall speak to Inspector Craddock again, and perhaps take another look at that shed." She left the office, her mind weaving the new information into the tapestry. The records had confirmed Vance's motive. His airline's survival depended on Grayson's failure. But the scuff marks and cigarette case suggested a physical act, one that required opportunity and access. Harris, with his resentment, was a candidate, but his need for his job made him cautious. Blake's fear suggested he knew something, but what? And Mrs. Wentworth's urgency hinted at a personal stake beyond business. As she stepped onto the tarmac, Miss Marple glanced at the maintenance shed, its door still ajar. The airfield was quieter now, the police having scaled back their search for the night. She thought of the scuff marks, the cigarette case, and the village gossip. Vance's meeting by the church, Harris's threats, Blake's nerves. Each was a piece, but the puzzle was incomplete. She would need to tread carefully, for the truth was close, and those who hid it would be watching. Mrs. Bantry, following her, broke the silence. "Jane, you're going to solve this, aren't you? I can feel it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I shall do my best, Dolly. The truth is like a shy creature. It hides, but it leaves tracks. We need only follow them." Chapter 10. The Trap is Set. The morning air over St. Mary Mead carried a crisp edge, the kind that hinted at autumn's full arrival, as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to the airfield. The skylark stood as it had for days, its gleaming fuselage a silent rebuke to the unresolved mystery of Captain Grayson's disappearance. The police presence had dwindled, with only a single constable patrolling the tarmac, but the tension in the air was palpable, as if the airfield itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple, her straw hat firmly in place and her handbag swinging lightly, felt the weight of the clues she had gathered: the cigarette case, the scuff marks, the financial records, and the village gossip. Each pointed to a web of motives, with Edward Vance's ambition at its center, but she needed more than suspicion to unravel the truth. Her conversations with Roger Blake, Tom Harris, Mrs. Clara Wentworth, and Vance himself had revealed their secrets and fears, but none had confessed to anything concrete. The airfield's records had confirmed Vance's motive. His failing airline, Skyward Ventures, stood to gain from a scandal that could ruin Grayson's operation. The scuff marks and cigarette case suggested a physical act, likely near the maintenance shed, but the who and how remained elusive. Miss Marple knew that human nature, when pressed, often betrayed itself, and she resolved to set a trap to flush out the guilty party. She found Inspector Craddock near the control tower, his face etched with the weariness of a case that refused to yield. His notebook was open, but his pen was idle, a sign of frustration Miss Marple recognized from past encounters. "Good morning, Inspector," she said, her voice as gentle as a breeze. "I trust you've had a restful night, though I suspect this mystery keeps you awake." Craddock managed a wry smile. "You're not wrong, Miss Marple. We've searched every inch of this airfield, dusted that cigarette case for prints, nothing but Grayson's own, and questioned everyone twice over. I'm beginning to think he's vanished into thin air." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "People rarely vanish, Inspector. They're hidden, or they hide themselves. I've been thinking about our suspects: Mr. Blake's nerves, Mr. Harris's grudge, Mrs. Wentworth's impatience, Mr. Vance's ambition. Each has a reason to wish Captain Grayson gone, but I believe Mr. Vance has the most to gain. His airline is failing, and a scandal here could save it." Craddock's eyebrows lifted. "You're keen on Vance, aren't you? He's slippery, I'll give you that, but we've no evidence against him. He was here, yes, but so were the others." Miss Marple nodded, her hands clasped over her handbag. "Evidence is sometimes a matter of timing, Inspector. I have an idea. A small deception, if you'll indulge me. In St. Mary Mead, I once caught a thief by letting it be known that a stolen ring had been found. The culprit panicked and revealed himself. Suppose we spread a rumor that Captain Grayson has been found, dazed but alive, and is about to name his attacker. The guilty party, if they're still watching, might act to protect themselves." Craddock's expression shifted from skepticism to cautious interest. "A trap, you mean? Risky, Miss Marple, but I'm out of ideas. How do you propose we do it?" Miss Marple's smile was faint but resolute. "Let Mrs. Bantry help. She's a marvelous gossip, though she'd never admit it. Have her mention casually, to anyone who'll listen, that Grayson was found in the woods, confused but recovering, and that he's speaking to the police this afternoon. Make sure it reaches the airfield, Mr. Blake, Mr. Harris, Mrs. Wentworth, and especially Mr. Vance. Then watch, Inspector. Someone will move, and quickly." Craddock rubbed his chin, considering. "It's a long shot, but I'll play along. I'll have my men keep an eye on the suspects, especially Vance. If he's behind this, he won't like hearing Grayson's talking." Miss Marple inclined her head. Precisely. And I shall be here, observing. The truth, you see, is like a startled bird. It flies when you least expect it. By noon, the rumor was spreading like wildfire, thanks to Mrs. Bantry's enthusiastic efforts. She chatted with the groundskeeper, Peter, who was sure to pass it on, mentioned it to Sally at the Blue Boar, who would tell every patron, and even dropped a hint to Mrs. Price at the post office, ensuring the village was abuzz. Miss Marple, meanwhile, positioned herself near the lounge, her knitting in hand, her eyes never straying far from the tarmac, the hangar, and the maintenance shed. The afternoon wore on, the airfield quiet save for the occasional drone of a distant plane. Roger Blake was seen pacing near the Skylark, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his face pale. Tom Harris emerged from the maintenance shed, his scowl deeper than usual, his wrench gripped tightly as he glanced around. Mrs. Wentworth, still in the lounge, was on the telephone, her voice sharp and urgent, though her words were inaudible. Edward Vance, however, was absent, and Miss Marple noted his absence with growing suspicion. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the tarmac, Miss Marple's patience was rewarded. A figure emerged from the direction of the village, a man moving quickly, his head down. It was Vance, his usual swagger replaced by a purposeful stride. He carried a heavy bag, slung over one shoulder, and made straight for the maintenance shed. Miss Marple's needles paused, her heart quickening. She signaled to Craddock, who was stationed discreetly near the control tower, and he nodded, gesturing to two constables hidden behind the hangar. Vance slipped into the shed, the door creaking as it closed behind him. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow to avoid drawing attention, and approached Craddock. "Inspector," she whispered, "I believe our bird has taken flight. Mr. Vance is in the shed, and I suspect he's not there to admire the tools." Craddock's jaw tightened. "Right, let's move." He signaled his men, and they converged on the shed, their steps silent but swift. Miss Marple followed at a distance, her eyes fixed on the door. A muffled sound came from within, a thud, then a low voice, sharp with urgency. Craddock pushed the door open, his torch cutting through the dim interior, and the scene was revealed. Captain Grayson was there, bound and gagged, slumped behind a stack of crates. His face was pale, his eyes wide with relief as the constables rushed to free him. Vance stood frozen, the bag at his feet, his hands raised as Craddock's men surrounded him. "It's not what it looks like," Vance protested, his charm crumbling. "I was just—" "Save it, Vance," Craddock snapped, cuffing him. "You've got some explaining to do." Miss Marple stood in the doorway, her expression serene, but her mind alive with satisfaction. The trap had worked, as she had known it would. Vance's panic at the rumor had driven him to check on his prisoner, revealing Grayson's hiding place. The scuff marks, the cigarette case, they all pointed to this shed, where Vance had stashed Grayson to orchestrate his scandal. Mrs. Bantry, who had hurried over at the commotion, gasped. "Jane, you did it. You found him. Oh, it's like a detective novel." Miss Marple's smile was modest. "Not quite, Dolly. It's simply a matter of knowing how people behave when they're cornered. Mr. Vance thought he could outsmart us all, but he forgot the simplest truth. Guilt always leaves a trail." As the constables led Vance away and Grayson was helped to his feet, Miss Marple stepped back, her work nearly done. The truth was close, but there were still questions, Vance's accomplices, if any, and the full extent of his plan. She would leave those to Craddock, But for now, the airfield was safe, and the mystery was unraveling. Chapter 11. The Confession. The evening air over St. Mary Mead was cool and still, the stars beginning to prick through the indigo sky as the airfield settled into an uneasy calm. The skylark, no longer a symbol of absence, stood on the tarmac under the watchful eye of a lone constable, its cockpit now a promise of resumed flights. Captain Grayson, shaken but unharmed, had been taken to the village doctor for a thorough check, leaving the maintenance shed, where he had been found bound and gagged, cordoned off as a crime scene. Inspector Craddock's men moved with renewed purpose, their torches casting sharp beams across the tarmac as they gathered evidence. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tucked away and her handbag resting lightly on her arm, stood near the lounge, observing the scene with the quiet satisfaction of one who had seen a knotty puzzle begin to unravel. The trap she had devised, spreading the rumor that Grayson had been found and was about to name his attacker, had worked precisely as she had hoped. Edward Vance, caught in the maintenance shed with Grayson, was now in custody, his polished charm replaced by a sullen defiance. Miss Marple knew, however, that the truth was not yet fully exposed. Vance's motives were clear. His failing airline, Skyward Ventures, stood to gain from Grayson's downfall, but the mechanics of his plan, and whether he had accomplices, remained to be uncovered. People, she knew, rarely acted alone in such schemes, and Vance's smooth confidence suggested he might have had help, perhaps from someone within the airfield's tight-knit circle. She made her way to the small office beside the control tower, where Craddock had set up a temporary questioning room. The office was stark, its walls lined with maps and schedules, its single desk cluttered with papers and a flickering lamp. Vance sat in a wooden chair, his hands cuffed, his jaw set as Craddock stood before him, notebook in hand. Miss Marple entered quietly, her presence barely noticed by the constable at the door, who was accustomed to her unobtrusive comings and goings. "Inspector," she said softly, "may I sit in? I find these matters so instructive, and I promise not to interfere." Craddock glanced at her, his expression a mix of resignation and respect. "Miss Marple, you've earned your place here. Just don't expect him to confess easily. He's been dodging questions like a fox." Miss Marple settled into a corner chair, her hands folded over her handbag, her eyes fixed on Vance. He was a changed man from the cocksure pilot she had met in the hangar, his smile gone, his eyes darting as if seeking an escape that no longer existed. She thought of Mr. Langley, the estate agent from St. Mary Mead, whose charm had crumbled under pressure, revealing a petty schemer beneath. Vance, she suspected, was cut from similar cloth, but his stakes were higher, his ambition sharper. Craddock began, his voice firm but calm. "Mr. Vance, you were found in the maintenance shed with Captain Grayson, who was bound and gagged. You've claimed it was a misunderstanding, but that won't hold. Why don't you save us all some time and tell us what you were doing?" Vance's lips twitched, a ghost of his former grin. "I told you, Inspector. I was checking the shed for tools. Heard a noise, found Grayson there. I was about to call for help when your men barged in." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, though her expression remained serene. "A curious story, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice gentle but piercing. "You see, I've known men like you in my village, charming, quick with a tale. But the maintenance shed is an odd place to look for tools, especially when you have no business there. And the cigarette case we found, Captain Grayson's dropped near the shed suggests he was there unwillingly. Perhaps you can explain that. Vance's eyes flicked to her, a flash of irritation breaking through his composure. I don't know anything about a cigarette case. Maybe Grayson dropped it earlier. Look, I'm not the villain here. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Craddock leaned forward, his patience thinning. The wrong place, with a bag that looks heavy enough to hold rope and a gag, and just after a rumor spread that Grayson was about to name his attacker? You moved fast, Vance. Too fast. Miss Marple tilted her head, her knitting needles retrieved from her bag, clicking softly. It's the timing that interests me, Mr. Vance. You were seen in the village 2 nights ago, meeting someone in a dark car near the church. Mrs. Price, our postmistress, noticed you. And then, this morning, you were at the airfield, near the hangar, when Captain Grayson vanished. It's almost as if you were planning something. Vance's face paled, his hands clenching in his lap. That's nonsense. I was visiting friends, that's all. You've got no proof. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. Proof is a matter of connecting threads, Mr. Vance. Your airline is failing, as the records show. Captain Grayson's success was drawing away your last clients. A scandal, a missing pilot, a grounded flight would ruin his reputation and save Skyward Ventures. It's a clever plan, but cleverness often trips over its own feet. Vance's composure cracked, his voice rising. You think I'd risk everything for that? I'm a pilot, not a kidnapper. Yes, Skyward's struggling, but I didn't touch Grayson. I found him in the shed, I swear. Craddock's eyes narrowed. Then who put him there? You're the one who ran to the shed the moment you heard he'd been found. Why? Vance's mouth opened, then closed, his shoulders slumping. The room was silent, save for the faint ticking of a clock and the soft click of Miss Marple's needles. She leaned forward, her voice soft but relentless. In Saint Mary Mead, I once knew a man who hid a stolen watch in his barn, thinking no one would look there. But he panicked when he heard the police were close, and he ran to move it. You ran to the shed, Mr. Vance. Why, if not to check on your handiwork? Vance's defiance shattered, his head dropping into his hands. All right, he muttered. It was me. I hired a man, a thug from Much Benham, to grab Grayson. Nothing serious, just to keep him out of the way for a day or two. The plan was to let him go, say it was a prank gone wrong. I needed his airline to take a hit, just enough to get my clients back. It was business, that's all. Craddock's pen scratched furiously across his notebook. Business? You call kidnapping business? Who was this thug, and where is he now? Vance hesitated, his eyes darting to the door. I don't know his name, just a man I met through a contact. He did the job, left Grayson in the shed, and took off. I was going to release Grayson tonight, I swear. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady. And the scuff marks, Mr. Vance? The cigarette case? Your man was careless, wasn't he? Dropping Grayson's case, leaving marks in the dirt. You thought you could control the chaos, but chaos has a way of betraying its masters. Vance's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his silence a confession in itself. Craddock snapped his notebook shut. That's enough for now. You're coming with us, Vance. We'll find your accomplice, and you'd better hope Grayson's story matches yours. As the constables led Vance away, Miss Marple rose, her expression serene but tinged with sadness. Greed and pride, Inspector, she said softly. They always lead to such foolish mistakes. Mrs. Bantry, who had been hovering outside, burst in, her face alight with excitement. "Jane, you've done it again. He confessed. Oh, it's thrilling." Miss Marple's smile was modest. "Thrilling, perhaps, but also rather sad, Dolly. Mr. Vance thought he could bend the world to his will, but the world has a way of bending back." As she stepped into the night, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the final threads. Vance's accomplice, and whether Blake, Harris, or Wentworth had played a part. The truth was nearly whole, but a few stitches remained to complete the tapestry. Chapter 12. The Resolution. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a gentle light that softened the edges of its thatched cottages and winding lanes. The airfield, which had been a hive of tension for days, was returning to its usual rhythm, the skylark once again preparing for flight now that Captain Grayson was safe. The police had concluded their work at the maintenance shed, and the tarmac was clear of constables, save for one lingering near the hangar, tying up loose ends. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor at Dane Mead Cottage, her knitting needles clicking steadily, the familiar rhythm a counterpoint to the quiet satisfaction in her heart. The mystery of Grayson's disappearance had been unraveled, thanks to her carefully laid trap and Edward Vance's confession. But there were still threads to be tied off, questions to be answered. Mrs. Bantry arrived promptly at 10, her face alight with the excitement of a woman who had witnessed a drama unfold. She settled into an armchair, her teacup rattling in its saucer as she leaned forward. "Jane, you must tell me everything. Vance in handcuffs, Grayson found. It's like something out of one of Arthur's detective novels. How did you know it was him?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "It wasn't so much knowing, Dolly, as seeing. People are like patterns in a piece of knitting. Each stitch tells a story if you look closely. Mr. Vance's ambition was the loudest stitch of all. His airline was failing, and Captain Grayson's success was the final blow. I suspected him from the moment I heard he was at the airfield, uninvited, on the morning of the disappearance." Mrs. Bantry sipped her tea, her eyes wide. "But the cigarette case, Jane, and those scuff marks, how did you put it all together?" Miss Marple's needles paused as she leaned back, her voice soft but precise. The cigarette case was the first real clue. It was Captain Grayson's, dropped near the maintenance shed, far from where he was last seen. That told me he hadn't vanished willingly. He'd been taken there, likely in a struggle, as the scuff marks suggested. The marks were in the shed, the hangar, and near the runway, all pointing to a hurried act. Mr. Vance, with his motive and his presence, was the most likely to have orchestrated it, but he needed help. His confession confirmed he hired a thug, a man unknown to us, who did the rough work. Mrs. Bantry gasped, setting her cup down with a clink. A thug? How dreadful! But what about the others? Blake, Harris, Mrs. Wentworth. Were they involved? Miss Marple shook her head, her needles resuming their rhythm. "I don't believe so, Dolly. Mr. Blake was frightened, but it was the fear of a young man out of his depth, worried he'd be blamed. His argument with Grayson was real, but it was about ambition, not malice. Mr. Harris's grudge was deeper, but he's a practical man. He needs his job, and harming Grayson would risk it. As for Mrs. Wentworth, her impatience was genuine, but her accusations against Vance were too quick, too pointed. I suspect she sensed his guilt, but had no part in it herself. She's a woman who protects her interests, not one to dirty her hands." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "So Vance acted alone?" Well, with his hired man, I mean. Quite so, Miss Marple said. He admitted to hiring someone to overpower Grayson and hide him in the shed, planning to release him after the scandal had done its work. It was a cruel plan, but not a murderous one. He underestimated how quickly suspicion would fall on him, and how a simple rumor would flush him out. People, you see, always betray themselves when they're afraid. Mrs. Bantry sighed, her excitement giving way to awe. You make it sound so simple, Jane, but it's positively brilliant. The police would still be searching the fields if it weren't for you. Miss Marple's smile was modest. Not simple, Dolly, just human. In St. Mary Mead, I've seen it time and again. People's motives, their fears, their pride. They leave traces like footprints in a garden, the cigarette case, the scuff marks, the gossip. They were all footprints leading to Mr. Vance. Mrs. Bantry reached for a scone, her eyes still wide. And what happens now? Will Grayson be all right? And Vance? What will become of him? Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Captain Grayson is shaken, but the doctor says he'll recover. He's a resilient man, and his airline will survive this. I think once the story fades. As for Mr. Vance, he'll face charges, kidnapping at the least. The police are searching for his accomplice, but I suspect that man is long gone. Vance's ambition was his undoing, as ambition so often is. The fire crackled, and Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to past cases in St. Mary Mead, where jealousy, greed, or fear had unraveled lives. This mystery, with its airfield setting and rival pilots, was grander in scale, but at its heart, it was the same. A story of human frailty. She picked up her knitting, the wool soft under her fingers, and resumed her work, the pattern emerging as clearly as the truth had. Mrs. Bantry, finishing her tea, broke the silence. You're a marvel, Jane. The village will talk about this for years. Miss Marple and the vanished pilot. Miss Marple laughed softly, a sound like the rustle of leaves. Let them talk, Dolly. I only hope they remember that the truth is never far away, if you know where to look. Now, would you like another scone? As Mrs. Bantry chattered on, Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, her mind at peace. The airfield was quiet again, the sky lark ready to fly, and the mystery was solved. But in St. Mary Mead, she knew, another puzzle would soon emerge, and she would be ready, as always, to find the threads that tied it together.